Final Fantasy XIV is an MMORPG produced by Square Enix that first released in 2010 and then re-released in 2013 after major reworking as A Realm Reborn. Rather impressively, it's been a game that has managed to exist for over a decade in the highly competitive MMO market, steadily improving and developing in the shadow of World of Warcraft, where a lot of other MMOs like WildStar or Rift have died. Then in mid-2021, FF14 experienced a period of explosive growth, rising through the ranks of the top 10 MMOs by population to quite possibly hitting the number 1 position. Without any official numbers and World of Warcraft basically being 2 games with retail and classic, it's hard to verify Final Fantasy's actual position, but unquestionably has become a player favourite, thrown to the forefront of the MMO genre as a gold standard. But what does Final Fantasy do to redefine the new gold standard for MMOs? That is the subject of this 4-part series broken down into Part 1, Combat and Characters, Part 2, World and Community, 3, Business and Development, then finishing off strong with Part 4, all about the story, which should give you about as comprehensive a review of Final Fantasy XIV as you could ever really want to have. To start with a little insight on how I'm approaching this review series, I will only be looking at things included between A Realm Reborn and Endwalker. The original version of the game has some relevance to the story, but for the most part I'll exclude it from the review proper. For more specific systems such as combat, I will exclusively be looking at how they're presented in Endwalker, as this is how both new and old players experience the game at the time of writing. With those clarifications out of the way, ladies and gentlemen, I invite you to join me as I give my own comprehensive review of Final Fantasy XIV. To start this part, I think it's important to note that Final Fantasy XIV is unique amongst its peers that you only really have one character. While people do have alts for various reasons, the vast majority of players will only have their main. This is primarily because you can do everything on a single character. Every class, profession, all the story and activities are available to you. So for this first part of the review, I want to discuss that character and all those options available in Final Fantasy XIV. Starting of course with the biggest thing you'll be engaging with, the combat. On a purely mechanical level, it's nothing special, but competently crafted. Using the old school click and kill method where you select target, press your abilities, then rinse and repeat until the bad guys die. The only variation in Final Fantasy, as opposed to similar games such as World of Warcraft, is that the skill cooldown is noticeably longer, but is compensated with the addition of instant cast abilities that you can use at any time. Getting into the flow of weaving instants between your normal combos ultimately gives everyone an ideal rotation of abilities to maximize damage. And while there are tons of variation between classes, this is how the basic combat system works. Interestingly, Final Fantasy XIV doesn't utilize combat in the same way as other MMOs, or nearly as much. A quest in WoW might ask you to kill 20 mobs, or an event in Guild Wars 2 might have waves and waves of baddies coming your way which you grind down. But in Final Fantasy XIV, this kind of kill emphasis is very scarce. That same quest might only ask you to kill 2 or 3 mobs, and a similar event might only require 10 or so total kills depending on how many people are around to scale it. This extends to dungeons and raids as well, with the former normally only having between 2 and 4 trash packs between bosses on average, and the latter rarely having any more than 2. As a result, there is far more emphasis on the boss encounters than anything else, and even when trash is present, there are normally some kind of mechanics like dodging AoEs, breath attacks, or just simply hard-hitting tank busters. You don't fight as often as other games, but when you do, there's always something to keep your brain engaged. Encounter mechanics are normally very movement-focused, which can present a challenge in maintaining that ideal rotation, as there's a lot to keep track of. For example, there's a boss where he cuts the room into 9 sections, and in one phase of the fight, he flies around it, puts constellations which you need to translate onto the room grid, and then run around appropriately to avoid the incoming meteorites. Other similar interesting mechanics also include rotating platforms, buildings being thrown at you from below the boss arena, Halo jumping towards a Tiger Man, and most dangerous of all, math. All of that just in normal modes as well, that everyone gets to go into with just pickup groups, not an extreme or harder difficulty you're doing with guildmates. However, an important thing to note is that not all bosses have those very specific mechanics like the rotating platforms or flying around. They actually use a fairly standard set of mechanics which all actually have very consistent markers or indicators which apply to all the bosses. For instance, if a boss is about to use a big area of effect spell, then a massive red zone which shows where the attack will land will be on the ground telling you to avoid it. When there's an ability that requires you to stack up, there's a separate indicator for that. Same for big single target tank busters, separated separating yourself from the group, where the boss will need to rotate. Really, just most mechanics that could come up has its own consistent marker, which when you learn them, makes Final Fantasy XIV's raiding incredibly accessible for the average person. This is all just on a mechanical level as well. The next stage up is just the sheer spectacle of these bosses, both in the design of the bosses themselves, but their abilities and arenas too. You can't comprehend some of the wacky stuff that comes up. I've been recently going back in doing some of the old 8-man raids, and the first boss in the Eden series has this ultimate attack where he basically converts the planet into a magic Death Star and shoots you into a galaxy. Then you take 1/5 of your health and get back to it, but there are some absolutely wild bosses, and it's rare for any game, MMO or not, to really match the level of crazy in some of these encounters. Those are just the bosses as well who don't have a monopoly on cool themes or abilities, as this is a good time to talk about the player classes, as they can be just as flashy to the point where if you don't turn down the effects from other players, you can lag out your computer in bigger raids. The Astromancer's Dome of Constellations, or any limit break ability specifically come to mind. And I'm not going to go through all of the classes, as currently in Endwalker there's a total of 20, which are split between tank, healer, and damage, so it would take some time to list off all the cool things each does, but I do want to talk about the very interesting class design differences between Final Fantasy XIV and its competitors on an overall level. And it's not just that they're flashier than other MMOs or that there's just so many, but in just how stuck each class is in their own role. For example, in World of Warcraft, the warrior class has 2 brands of damage and a tank spec. In Guild Wars 2, that warrior has even more build options for a myriad of playstyles. But in Final Fantasy XIV, if you pick the warrior job, all you do is tank. There are no talents, no builds, no other type of gear you can equip. When you pick up the Soulstone of a warrior, you are a tank. This is a bit of a double-edged sword for the game. Due to the limited design scope per job, it allows for way more of them. Guild Wars 2 only has 9 total classes, and World of Warcraft will now have 13 with the Evoker and Dragonflight. In comparison to Final Fantasy's 20 total, with roughly 2 new classes coming for each expansion release. Having a system that allows for this many classes really gives the team room to experiment with design, playstyle, and different class aesthetics. The Red Mage is a key example of this. The Battle Mage design is surprisingly rare to find in most games. With these kinds of class systems and actual job playstyle of casting short-time spells followed up by instant longer ones, trying to balance out your magic and then going into the melee for a bit of burst window is incredibly cool. The Black Mage as well, which is far more in line with the traditional caster class, has an absurd amount of going on with its ebb and flow between fire and ice magics. I really could go on, but the conclusion is that the diversity of jobs and the unique class mechanics makes up for the lack of internal variation within each one. Well, it does once you've got them leveled, as this is the downside of having limited job scopes. Players are restricted with their play options until they put in a significant time investment. To return to the WoW example, once you're at max level warrior, you can switch between tank and DPS at a whim. You only need to level the class once, while in Final Fantasy XIV, if you made the warrior your main job, then you can't switch out to another role without putting in all the time to level up another job. This can be annoying as these classes suck to play at earlier levels. Adding complexity over time is very natural for games, and some of these jobs can get pretty crazy, but the learning curve early on is almost a flat line with how slow it is to get abilities. I'd go out on a limb and say that almost every class feels bad to play until level 50, and then from there it gets exponentially more fun every 10 levels thereafter, until after some point you just realize how deep the class you're playing really goes. It's clear that this is something on the developer's radar too. The reworks to a lot of skills over time, and starting most new jobs for the latest expansion at far higher levels to avoid that early grind. I'll also say that as a tidbit at the end, I am aware that you do get more XP when you're leveling a job that's lower level than your highest, but it just makes the boring bit go a little bit quicker, as I can almost promise you that this slow gameplay is one of the biggest hurdles every new player comes across when they're first coming into the game. Now, the last thing I'd like to touch on in this section is one of the most important aspects of any RPG, and one of the biggest incentives for a lot of people to play: the loot and the gearing system more broadly. To start with those broad strokes of how gear works, just like how the job roles are very restrictive, what gear each can use is also very stringent. In other MMOs, gear will normally be split into 3 to 4 categories, such as cloth to plate or light to heavy, while Final Fantasy XIV has 7, with each type having an affix to a piece of gear like fending, maiming, or striking, and then only specific classes can use each type. The fending gear, for example, is only equipable by tanks, and tanks can only use that. This really makes the gear and loot just boring, as each piece of gear is basically custom made for your class. The stats and also the aesthetic is fashioned around your role, so really you just need to find high item level stuff stuff, and you can be confident that it'll be better without looking too much into it. In comparison to Guild Wars 2, where the distribution of stats is incredibly important, and two pieces of gear at the same level can have a huge difference in how much damage you deal. So the aim of the game is just to get a higher item level. The name of the gear or anything else it does really doesn't matter. Everything you equip is just a stat stick, and it is really, really dull. There isn't ever that feeling of planning what pieces you want in World of Warcraft, figuring out what bosses drop it, and then the excitement when you get it, let alone really unique and interesting pieces of gear like the Warglaives of Azeroth. It's just slow stat progression, which isn't mega engaging. I will put a few caveats to my points here before I continue, so you don't have to mention it in the comments. First, each piece of gear does have materia slot, which you can put in, well, materia, to add stats to it which the piece of equipment doesn't already have, which, while a nice feature, really just lets you lean a bit more into your main. It doesn't mitigate the issue of stat stick status, or that higher item level is just better. Secondly, the true use of gear is aesthetics, and yeah, that's true, but we'll get onto that in part 2 of this series. Then lastly, the one exception to the lack of hell yeah feeling of getting gear is with the artifact weapon that comes out midway through each expansion. Grinding those up is one hell of a process, and while it still fits the slow gear progression style as everything else, the time investment and prestige around having it is very nice feeling when you get one to max level. Now, to move on to where you'll actually do the majority of your combat, alt leveling, gearing, class exploration, and just in-game activities more broadly, I want to touch on the LFG and roulette systems, which are the two sides of the party matching system. In general terms, as you progress through the game's story, you'll unlock dungeons, trials, raids, encounters, and story-specific side quests. When you unlock a new encounter, it's added to your LFG tool, and then you can enter a queue for it, which will automatically fill the party appropriately. So if you queue as a damage class, then you'll be matched with another damage, healer, and tank in the case of a 4-man dungeon. The people who are coming in to fill your group are typically coming from the roulette side of the system. Each day, a player gets a single massive bonus for queuing to each of the roulette categories. These can range from general leveling, 50 plus dungeons, max level dungeons, single boss trials, to big alliance raids, and more. Players that aren't max level for the roulettes are rewarded with massive bonus experience, skill, and other rewards in scale with their own level. Max level players are instead rewarded with tomestones, which are valuable for gear acquisition, enabling players to reach current or very close to best in slot equipment just by doing a random daily dungeon. This reward system means that the dungeon parties are typically a mix of new and experienced players, encouraging people to help each other out. New players can easily find a group, and groups will typically have experienced players who can explain what's going on if there's a weird mechanic at play. Teamwork and cooperation between players is the core of the system here, and everyone is rewarded handsomely for taking part. As an aside, another big thing when it comes to looking for group tool is its new sister system, the Trust. This allows you to go through dungeons with a group of AI companions rather than real people. Currently only in Shadowbringers, Endwalker, and now with 6.1, A Realm Reborn instances as well, this is something that they're developing more and more. So soon, you'll basically be able to go through the entire main quest line without ever having to deal with another person. Just to move on to leveling more specifically, however, while doing the daily roulettes is going to be one of the biggest ways to get experience, this isn't the only way to gain XP, as the first of the main ways are quests, which are broken down into two parts. The first type are side quests, which are normally pretty quick, can give you really neat little details about the world, and award a little bit of experience and gold. The second are tribal quests, which are daily quests with a reputation associated with them. Each tribe has 3 quests you can do a day with a total limit of 12 daily, all providing tons of experience, and if you get to the max rep, there's also a mount in it for you, which gives you a nice little extra incentive to get on them. Next way to get experience and more efficient are fates, which are just random world events with different goals between killing a single big guy, or killing a lot of little guys, or picking up a lot of stuff from the ground and dropping them off. There's nothing super revolutionary about the objectives here, but they're nice experience, and the names of most fates are pretty good memes. The developers clearly had a lot of fun writing them, so it's worth reading just for those. Thirdly, you have access to the Challenge Journal, which is a weekly set of objectives which award extra experience when you complete them, although these are always the same and fairly basic, like complete 5 dungeons or 10 fates, but it's still nice to get a little extra reward for doing stuff you'd be likely doing anyway. Then lastly, when you hit an area known as Idleshire near the end of Heavenswood, you'll get access to the Wondrous Tales, which gives you 16 or so random objectives like completing dungeons in a certain level range, doing older raids, or engaging in PvP. The first 9 of these you complete gives you a sticker on a 4x4 grid, and if you randomly get a 4 in a row, you get an extra reward when you hand it in. You always get half a level of experience as well, so it's always worth switching to an alt class before handing it in, but this is a really cool way of incentivizing people to go and engage with older content. While combat combat is really dull at early levels, which naturally makes leveling equally as boring, there are still enough options to keep you sane until you clear that level 50 hurdle. Afterwards, leveling opens up to be really fun. The side quests especially are pretty interesting because they fill in cool little details about how the people in Final Fantasy XIV live their day-to-day lives and just complete the world building that's that little bit more. That's all to do with the PvE combat, but of course, like any other MMO out in the market, there is also a player versus player or PvP component as well, which is so different from normal combat experience that it does deserve its own mention. For starters, each and every class has an entirely separate and streamlined set of abilities just for PvP. In addition, these abilities are not gradually unlocked over time as you level, but are given to you in their entirety when you enter a PvP lobby or battleground. This system makes PvP a surprisingly interesting way to level a character as well, and gives you another option in the roulette aside from just PvE combat. While PvP is certainly not really a focus of the Final Fantasy team or the community broadly, there are still 3 different PvP modes as of the 6.1 patch. First, you have dueling, which is a classic one-on-one bit of combat. You start in one of the arenas present in the Wolf's Den, which is the PvP zone, with all the associated vendors. Secondly is Frontline, which is the only PvP mode with a looking for group roulette attached. This is a 72-player PvP mode split between 3 teams of 24, where you can capture points, then complete map-specific objectives, which are mainly killing things or capturing certain points in different places. Then lastly is the newest mode called Crystalline Conflict, which is basically a push-the-cart style of game mode where both teams are pushing the same crystal cart, and the one who went the furthest by the end wins. Since Endwalker's release, there has been a big restructuring in the PvP system, and some of the older game modes have been swapped for new PvP challenges. For example, The Feast, a team deathmatch style game, was replaced by the Crystalline Conflict in patch 6.1. While providing for a PvP system is clearly on the Final Fantasy XIV team's radar, it's not one of the big elements that people play the game for. So while it's certainly a competent and, more importantly, well-balanced system, it's not the most exciting way to play the game, in my personal opinion. So all that being said, I think I've reasonably covered the PvE and PvP combat. So next up, let's take a look at another aspect of the class system, the professions. Just like the rest of the class system, in Final Fantasy XIV, your own Warrior of Light can be every profession. But unlike most other MMOs on the market, all these professions do act like actual classes, with their own skill sets, gear, and stats associated with both the gathering and crafting process. Professions tend to be a lot more involved and require a degree of skill, at least when doing high-end crafting or optimizing how much you can get out of gathering. That's not to say numerical skill requirements don't exist. A level 1 miner can't go and mine level 90 material, for instance. You do need to get better gear and naturally need to be a high level to wear it. Just like with leveling for any other traditional classes, FF14 has a good amount of ways for you to level up your professions. First, there's the normal just grind the profession by crafting and gathering stuff. You are rewarded a single big experience bonus the first time you craft or gather anything, so there is a good incentive to diversify what you're doing. Secondly, there are deliveries, which are kind of like self-contained reputation where you create or gather 6 specific things for a character, which grant massive amounts of experience and profession currency. Each of these characters have their own mini-stories like Chloe's Orphanage or Menango's rebuilding effort, and at the end of that reputation, you can even dress these characters, which can be a bit of fun. In total, you can do 12 of these deliveries per week, 6 per character who needed deliveries done, with them resetting weekly, so it's an important thing to keep up with them if you're serious about crafting. The tons of XP is also a very nice little incentive. Thirdly, and less important now, is the Ishgardian Restoration Front. This is a server-wide event all about rebuilding the city of Ishgard, which is very prominent in Heavenswood. This includes an entire instant zone where you can gather very specific materials which reward great gathering XP. You can then take them and craft specific restoration stuff, which can then be handed in for scripts that can then be used for tons of rewards, including cosmetics and mounts. You're also ranked on your contributions per profession, and if you basically get a high score on literally every profession, you can get the Pterodactyl mount, which is far and away the most godless one to acquire in-game. Either way, the new housing district Imperium in Ishgard is the in-game culmination of these efforts, but the front remains open as a way to quickly level your professions, starting from about level 20 for each of them. Beyond leveling, it's probably worth touching on the minigame you play when crafting stuff. In short, you need to balance your synthesis progress with quality versus the durability of the item. Durability is basically the health of the item you're crafting, and so long as you complete the synthesis, even if it would take the durability down to 0, you craft the thing successfully. So really, it's just a game of pumping in as much quality in between actually making the thing as possible, which results in a higher collectability in the case of deliveries, series, or a higher chance the item becomes high quality, which are strict upgrades on normal versions. There are a few other things you can do, like restoring durability, conditions where there are multipliers, both positive and negative, for increasing quality, as well as a few little tricks here and there, but for the most part it's just pumping quality and sneaking in the craft at the very end. Although thankfully for a lot of these things you only need to do this minigame once. You don't need to manually craft everything. After you make something once, you can then auto-create it, which is great for mass producing stuff like ingots, which you need a ton of. The stuff you really want to pay attention to is the very high-end crafting, as if you can make master crafted gear, it's on par with some of the stuff that you can get from raids, which makes gearing alts very quick. Another way of leveling, and something very important to all the classes, both combat and professional, are the storylines for each. These are important not only for leveling, but also providing an excellent storyline for everything you do, which is one of the core reasons to play Final Fantasy XIV in the first place. The Shadowbringers Dark Knight quest especially comes to mind here. And while these are important to the classes, I will be touching them in part 4 of this review series all about the story. I just wanted to make sure that you know I haven't forgotten about them. So to conclude, when it comes to just the combat, both on the PvE and PvP level, it's competent and a little different with how its cooldowns work, but nothing that I'd write home about. How they use that combat though is absolutely brilliant. Every boss is a gameplay and visual feast. The focus on these bosses works incredibly well to the strengths of the game and was a brilliant design choice by the Final Fantasy team. Professions are incredibly unique, engaging, and can be very rewarding, especially if you can craft those high-end pieces which sell for big bucks. Both of these gameplay styles have a myriad of ways to level up, and you have almost unlimited access to the game on your single character, which makes diversifying your playstyle really easy, if not rewarding to try. Really, that's kind of the biggest thing about Final Fantasy XIV. There is an absolute ton to do, and they've made an effort to make sure going back to older stuff, either intentionally or through the roulette system, is rewarding as well. It really lets you play the game you want to play and explore when you want to. There's never just this fear of missing out, as beyond the occasional season event, everything is always there for you to do in your own time. While not perfect by any stretch, everything is at a minimum perfectly functional, and where the game shines, it's almost blinding. Thank you for joining me for part 1 of this comprehensive review. This was originally going to be one big video, but after a couple of script reworks, found this way will work a bit better overall. So to stay tuned for part 2 about the world and the community, subscribe below. Until then, thank you again for your time, and have an absolutely excellent day.